Anyway, my being in Kabul resulted from something that you should never do. Whenever you get a call from the Pentagon, you should listen very carefully to what they say. And so when they called me and asked me to go to Kabul, I was not listening carefully. I thought they said Cabo. And so I was, yeah, sure, I want to go to Cabo. But it ended up being Kabul, So listen carefully. If you ever get a call from the Pentagon, listen carefully. You know that very well. When you get a call from the Pentagon, you listen very, very carefully to what they say. So my wife and I, we went on a vacation to Norway in June, even though we're not big vacationers. Now, let me back up a little bit. I had a friend who became a follower of Jesus in the 70s in Iowa at a monastery. And he found himself living at a nearby convent for the next 5 years. Now, this guy later moved to Manhattan, and I met him on his very first day in Manhattan. And this friend of mine, he became a friend of rich guys and street people. How's that for a combination? Now, one of the rich guys funded the construction of a convent in Norway that was being founded by the nuns that he had lived with back in Iowa. And when my friend heard that Ann and I were going to go to Norway for a vacation, he insisted that we go to a convent on the northwest, on an island called Tautra off the northwest coast of Norway, to stay in, again, a convent built by one of his rich friends that had been staffed by his former nun friends. The rich guy that built the convent was, by that point, dead. And most of you have probably by this point realized that the friend I'm talking about is BJ from Iowa, who is now also dead. This little vignette of my life really depicts how that B.J. Weber was able to span the full range of human existence, from penniless nuns and street pimps to rich guys like Al McDonald, who funded the monastery, the new convent, and Jim Lane and Paul Mikowski. B.J. moved effortlessly between people of great wealth and no wealth and status at all. Did I tell you that I met BJ on his first day in New York City? So I was sitting in a restaurant when BJ arrived, having walked over from, in Times Square, the restaurant was in Times Square, having walked over from Port Authority, wearing still a denim jacket and cowboy boots. I remember it. And I looked at him and I thought to myself, I'll give this guy about 6 weeks in New York City. Well, guess what? I was wrong by about 43 and a half years. BJ actually only left Manhattan last month. BJ set up shop at the Lambs Club of the Nazarene in Times Square. And by night, he would be out meeting, praying with, caring for street people. And then one morning a week, he would have a Bible study. And I was a part of that Bible study with a group of other baby bankers and lawyers. I was working at that time at a big law firm in Wall Street. Now, I want to say this Bible study was really good for me because at that point, I had been a follower of Jesus for all of about 3.5 years. But at that point, I can assure you, I was following at a very safe distance. I had not had a very dramatic conversion experience. In fact, I came to faith having met, I said I was a lawyer. I came to faith having met the civil standard of evidence, not the criminal standard. So that I had come to faith through preponderance of the evidence, not beyond a reasonable doubt. So consequently, I thought that it was more probable than not that I was a sinner. And I thought that it was more probable than not that I was out of relationship with God. And I thought that it was more probable than not that Jesus was who he said he was. But then my confidence level rose, because at that point, I did believe beyond a reasonable doubt that if all those other things were true by the preponderance of the evidence, that there was no way I was going to be able to get myself right back with God except for his mercy and grace. And I had that confidence beyond a reasonable doubt. But let me digress for a second and say that if you have a choice between a salvation story like mine and having a testimony that involves your having kicked a cocaine habit right before your G5 was about to crash with your mistress and your dealer who's about to off you, pick the latter, pick that latter testimony, because I will tell you, it forms a much better platform for growth. With BJ, I only encountered people who had a salvation story completely unlike mine. One morning, BJ brought a guy into our Bible study of baby bankers and lawyers. And this guy looked like he was right out of Superfly Central Casting. He looked exactly like what you would think a street pimp in the late 70s would look like. And his name was Alfonso. And as BJ introduced Alfonso to us, he said that Alfonso had come to Christ that very morning. I found this very intriguing. And so I said to Alfonso, so tell me, Alfonso, how did you come to believe in Jesus? I mean, it's been a long journey you've been on. And he said, yeah, man, I've been interested in God for quite a long time. He said, but I didn't know much about God. I said, so what did you do? He said, well, you know these guys in Times Square, the guys that wear the little beanie hats that are out there with these tables, a bunch of this oil stuff they're selling? I said, yeah, those are Muslims, I believe. He said, well, I didn't know much about that. He said, but I did know that those folks thought they knew something about God. So he says, I goes up to those guys and I say, hey, do you know anything about God? And Alfonso says that one of those guys told me, he said, yeah, I know a lot about God. In fact, Alfonso says, how is that? He says, because I lives with God. Alfonso says, you lives with God? And the man said, yes, I lives with God. And Alfonso then said, so where do God live? And the guy said, Flatbush. And Alfonso looks at me and he says, David, at that point, I didn't know a lot about God, but I know God did not live in Flatbush. And so he was primed. When BJ told him where the real God was, Alfonso was primed to take a step forward, and he did. So late one night in 82 actually it was, my wife and I, we lived on the Upper West Side before the Upper West Side was cool. And I get a call from BJ. And this is back in the time when, some of you will remember this, when you got a call, that the little box on your desk would ring and you would pick up something and you could, you'd be able to talk to somebody by holding this thing in your hand. So I get a call from BJ. He says, what you doing? I said, nothing, just hanging here with Ann. He said, can you meet me up in Harlem in about an hour? I said, yeah. Why? He said, a friend of mine has called. He has a runaway daughter, and he's afraid that she's up in Harlem turning tricks. He said, I want to go find her. He said, and I want somebody to come with me. And I was not prepared for this. But I said, yeah, I'll do it. He said, okay, I'll meet you at Broadway and 125th at 11 o'clock. And I hang up. And in about 2 minutes, the phone rings again. And BJ says, do you have any cowboy boots? I said, well, yeah. He said, wear them. I said, okay. Can I ask why? He said, yeah. If you wear cowboy boots, they'll think you're an undercover cop and you're less likely to get shot. And I thought, this is the only kind of, you don't get this kind of information unless you've been out in that situation before. And so BJ, he was the real deal. But BJ was constantly asking me to get involved with guys that he had met on the streets. And so I went and visited Smitty, who was the smartest scam artist in the world in Rikers Island, and got to hear about his experiences. There were multiple times when BJ would call me and ask me to go over to the Manhattan lockup over in Police Plaza and meet with somebody who he had been with, who he now had been arrested. And no matter how many times I told BJ this, BJ would always say, hey, look, David, it's only 8 minutes from your office. Just go over there. And no matter how many times I told BJ that just because I could defend against a hostile tender offer did not mean that I had any utility at all to a petty felon. But he never could get that straight. And so BJ and I, we saw a lot of each other all through the 80s. And that was encouraged by the fact that his wife Sheila and my wife Ann were both the same age, and they had very similar personalities. And because of that, BJ and I spent 40 years being able to commiserate with one another in the different stages of life. And an important part of that commiseration in our latter years was our mutual deep, deep gratitude for Viagra. And what was happening to my faith during this time? I was actually growing in gratitude for mercy and redemption that was occurring in other people. I told you that I came to faith not through a crisis or tragedy. My entire life has been lived without a lot of felt drama. Now, I did grow up as a dirt poor kid in Georgia. I was a half-breed, half redneck, half trailer trash. I got out of that situation. I look back today, and what was in fact probably a lot of bullying that was going on, I thought of it, I just got in a lot of fights because I was a fat, smart-ass kid. But I got out of it and continued on with my life, and just not much bad stuff ever happened. Now you may think, oh, that's really good. It's good. But there's a real downside to having lived a life like that. And that is that it's really hard for God to use you. God does his best work with men who have been broken and hurt. Jesus had a tender heart. And for him to use men, it requires that we have tender hearts. Rich, you and I were sort of talking about that just a little bit ago. For Jesus to use us, we have to have tender hearts. And I'll tell you, there is no pathway to a tender heart except through suffering. But I hadn't experienced a lot of suffering. But I was living a life with BJ. And so what did I do? You know what I did? I borrowed suffering. Now you may think, is that actually a thing? How do you borrow suffering? Well, that's what compassion is. Compassion is borrowing someone else's suffering and taking it on as your own. Now, I will never have the deep well of compassion that BJ had, no matter how long I live. Compassion
for one thing, is it's not consistent with my well-developed ministry of criticism and rebuke. But do some of you others have that ministry as well? But that was the amazing thing about BJ. He could combine a deep and abiding compassion with a full calling out of what needed to change in your life. He administered grace without letting you off the hook to amend your life. And that's really the key, to administer grace without letting you off the hook to amend your life. Because of BJ and the way he was compassionate with accountability, you could find yourself telling him some of the deepest and darkest parts of your life. I have experienced in many of them through New Canaan Society environments the miracle of relationship where God puts in place another man to accomplish in us something that we desperately need and could never have done on our own. And I've seen this over and over again. So I want to bring you up to date with me. The onset of COVID was extremely hard for me. I had no health concerns. I wasn't concerned at all about catching COVID. But I found myself in the early weeks of COVID falling apart because of the financial impact of COVID. Now again, I'd been through 9/11, I'd been through the dot-com bust, I'd been through the financial crisis, I'd even been through the 80s Asian financial crisis. But for some reason, it was different this time. And I think part of it was my age. You know, I'm older. Am now older then. But as I found my net worth shrinking by 50%, getting private equity capital calls when I had zero liquidity, and I still serve on airline boards. And so the one that I chair, we went in a period of 3 weeks from adopting the most profitable and growing plan ever to hiring bankruptcy lawyers. And the combination of these things was I completely fell apart and I began experiencing panic attacks. Now, I've always made fun of people who would talk about having a panic attack. I would sort of say, oh, you had a panic attack. Tell me what was that like? Well, I don't do that anymore because I know what they are like. All the principles that I had been keeping track of for daily living, in the crisis of the moment, they all fell apart. I was even, Chip Scoburn and I had dinner last night. I was even saying that my wife was not even supportive because she sort of realized what is going on here is not really rational. Something, I don't know what's happening to my husband. It's not entirely rational. Because it's not like that we were not going to be able to afford to buy groceries the next day. And when I look back, it was not rational. But what I think happened during that time was that God intentionally withdrew his presence from me so that I could see in vivid reality the extent of my idolatry of wealth and public position and the grandiosity in which I had lived my life. I had begun to live my life as if I would always be in a time of plenty. I had never made preparations for needing to live on the money I had. I'd sort of seen all of it as being sort of house money. And some of it was going to have to be my money. And there had been so much hubris that I had conducted my life and my affairs with. And when I saw the potential of it all coming to a crashing end, I saw just how ungrateful I had been for all that God had done, how prideful I had been in the conduct of my life, and how idolatrous I had been of the money and the public position and status that comes with having money. And God showed me how fleeting and failing those things are when you most want to hold on to them. When you most want to have an idol support you, that's when it fails. And so at the very time that I wanted to be able to have confidence that I would make it through this financial crisis without having to sell my house or whatever, that's the time when it fails you. It does not provide the confidence and the hope. And so I moved from panic to awareness to I actually moved into self-loathing. And because I just felt so stupid for the things I had done that had brought me to that position. And I was in a place of true self-loathing. And a buddy of mine, who I don't even know this guy extremely well, but I was telling this, he says at some point, he says, David, it sounds to me like you need to forgive yourself. I said, what do you mean, forgive yourself? He said, well, look, if someone had done to you what you are saying you have done to yourself, wouldn't you think that person would be a candidate for forgiveness? I said, well, I guess so. He said, well, you have done that to yourself. You need to forgive yourself. And so I went through, he said, you need to make a list of all the things you think you've done to yourself to hurt you over the last however many years you want to account for. And you need to forgive yourself. And he took me through a forgiveness of myself exercise. And I will tell you, friends, it worked just like it was supposed to. I felt a burden lifting as I was able to forgive myself for the things I had done to put myself into the position that I was finding so painful. And so I want to end by saying that I have been snatched out of bad places repeatedly by other brothers. I like to think that I am self-sufficient, but God regularly puts me in situations where I recognize I am not self-sufficient. I need other brothers. Those people who say, oh, my wife is my best friend. You know, she takes care of all of my emotional needs. Those people are self-deluded. Those people are self-deluded. That we need other men in order to move to the place of God's intention for us, and especially to pull us out of the holes that we are inclined to step into. So brothers, I'm so glad you are here this morning. Keep it up. It's got a great plan here, and I'm just so grateful to be able to be with you this morning. Blessings.